Alright, in my last lecture we talked about the business of research. We went over everything that you are seeing on your screen right now. The goal is to find articles, books, or whatever that show the conversation in academia as it is now. Your topic should be controversial, namely something that could be debated, something that people actually have valid opinions about, and that you can make an argument one way or the other. We talked about viable sources, specifically peer-reviewed sources by leading scholars in the field, or the things you want to find most of all. You could also use other historical sources on the subject from the era, like in mythology, like Plato or some of the Greek writers. In philosophy, any of the historical philosophers we've been talking about. And you can also use popular publications by scholars, but make sure that they are in fact scholars and they are in fact legitimate. What you don't want are randos on the internet. In their various forms and flavors. We also talked about how you totally should use Wikipedia and other summary pages like Livius or like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to do your research, but you should not quote them because you are looking for the actual arguments, not the summaries of those arguments. So that's sort of our summary on research. But today I want to talk about the other end here. I want to talk about actually sitting down and writing your paper and what it takes to write a good paper. And again, this is probably rehashing a lot of stuff that you've heard before. If that's the case, fine, just, tune me out, play more Animal Crossing, whatever you're going to do. But honestly, this is a good reminder for a lot of people. I'm going to talk about what I specifically am looking for, and generally this works for a lot of professors in a lot of places. So I would take it seriously. It's good advice, and it will help you in more than just this class. You will notice, though, that while I did present a specific lecture for each of my philosophy and mythology classes, so there was one lecture for mythology and there was one lecture for philosophy, today I'm combining them. Because the same tips work across the board. The only difference is we are going to talk about Chicago style at the end of this, so don't worry about that. If you were in my humanities class, you can totally use MLA, but we'll come back to that. So first off, I want to rehash a couple of tips that I gave you earlier, namely the general tips for grammar and punctuation. I talk about them after the response papers are due, basically every semester, and it's a good refresher to just go over them once again. So first off, use short, simple sentences. There's no reason to try and snow me with fancy academic language. If you want to see fancy academic language in action, trust me, I can show you fancy academic language in action. But nonetheless, as from where you're sitting, I would rather have you mastered the whole grammatical punctuation issue, not trying to ambitiously impress me with your command of the English language, and instead ambitiously impress me with your command of the subject matter that you're talking about. Give me something to sink my teeth into, and I won't notice the fact that your sentences are short, sweet, and simple. And it'll prevent you from making glaring grammatical errors, which ultimately will cause me to think less of your paper and to dock points because you don't know how to use a semicolon properly, or this is the 14th clause in your first sentence. So when in doubt, again, short, simple. Keep it straightforward. Use only one finite verb and one subject in a sentence. If you cannot express your point in a short, simple sentence, maybe rethink your point. As the famous Einstein quote goes, you don't understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother. The same holds true for any subject in philosophy or mythology or the humanities or anything. Keep the sentences short and simple. Likewise, watch your sentence structure. I stressed before that you should definitely check out the OWL page on sentence structure if you're not familiar with it. Again, stuff like independent and dependent clauses. That's just helpful. I know a lot of students struggle with sentence structure, the basics. As much as, there are professors who will get irritated if you drop off the Oxford comma, I am much more interested in making sure that you know how a sentence works at a very basic level. So again, keep those sentences short and simple, but make sure that you have your one subject, your one finite verb. Don't start a sentence with an ing verb unless you know why you're doing it. Don't let your sentences dangle without a subject. Don't construct your sentence in such a way that you accidentally lose track of your verb. Again, using short and simple sentences will help with that, but just keep an eye on it all the same. reviewing might be a good bet. And then lastly, read your paper aloud yourself, or get somebody else to read it if you can. There's a lot that you'll catch when you actually hear yourself read your own words. There's a lot that you miss when you're staring at the page, which you've been reworking a sentence for 5 minutes, that will suddenly become obviously wrong when you read it to yourself and hear the fact that you don't have a verb in your sentence. And likewise, getting somebody else to read your paper will help you see the stuff that isn't quite clear that makes sense in your own brain. So those are the little fiddly details we talked about, like how to make your sentences shine, how to make your actual grammar and punctuation, foundational building blocks of how language works, how to make that work in your paper, be it your response papers or your big research paper or whatever. But now I want to turn our attention to just the general tips on paper writing, on the macro level, big picture stuff. And to that purpose, I have a number of sample papers that I'd like to just discuss a little bit. This is one of my papers from a few years ago. It is from my old humanities, or general humanities 2 class. In that class, we talk about various versions of the Don Juan and Faust myths. And the goal of this paper is to take 2 of the works in one of these traditions, either Don Juan or Faust, and compare and contrast them. And if you're in my mythology class, that should sound very familiar. That's very much what we do in the comparison paper. That's a lot of what we find ourselves doing in the midterm. Again, the whole point is to sort of identify the cultural assumptions that underlie each work. So that's very much what we're doing with Homer in the term paper. So while I don't have an actual mythology paper to show, don't worry about it because this will apply. But let's look at it for a moment, because while there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad about this paper, and I want to sort of break it down and show what's going right and what's going wrong. But to start with, let's look at this first introductory paragraph. There are many books from the 17th century, and even now, that are based on the time period in which the author lives in. There are even many books that are based off past tales that have been told countless times, but are rearranged to fit the author's time period and tell a story with different but similar meanings and perspectives. One example of a story that has been told countless times throughout history is the Faustian story that has been traced back to the first Faust chapbook written in 1587. The story of Faust is about a highly praised scholar who sells his soul to the devil, Mephistopheles, because he wishes to have more power and knowledge in life. One novel that captures the story well is the tragic play Faust Part 1 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Some of the Faust details are also found, or is emphasized, in other novels that the authors have based it on. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov in 1942 is an example of such. There are many points in Bulgakov's novel that are related to Goethe's play. Now again, this is not a perfect introduction. I don't present it as a perfect introduction. My student does a lot of good things later on in the paper, but the intro is kind of a mess. You'll notice, this sentence, for example, some of the Faust details are also found or is emphasized, is just so broken in so many ways. It very much violates a lot of those sentence structure rules that we talked about, and if you don't know why, maybe look that up. What it does correctly, though, is it does actually identify what are the 2 texts that we're going to talk about, specifically Faust Part 1 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, which are the 2 major texts in the class. But, for all that, this is a really fluffy introduction, and as you probably noticed, my first guideline for paper writing is no fluff. Avoid fluff whenever possible. None of the papers I assign for any of my classes are terribly large. I realize that it's like a 1,500 word assignment in both my mythology and general humanities classes. I realize that it's like a 5 to 6 page paper in my philosophy classes. Compared to the 2 8-page papers that were pretty standard when I was an undergrad, that's not a big deal, and that is nowhere close to the sort of 16-page term paper that you get used to in your 400 level classes. You do not have room for fluff, is what I want to emphasize. And there is a real tendency for students to want to start their introductions with this sort of grandiose setting stuff. my philosophy students will often write, "Since the dawn of mankind, humans have looked up at the stars and wondered, is there a God in the heavens? After much philosophizing, many great minds have tackled this topic, and many have come to different conclusions." And what I want to stress is, don't do that. Like, don't. Just don't. I know that it's an important topic. I know that it's an important question. I know this because I wrote the question. Like, I've realized that hundreds of people have been writing about this topic since the dawn of time. The same is true with Homer. Like, there are so many writers who have weighed in on Homer in the 2,800 years since it has been a thing. He's obviously a big deal. Don't feel like you need to just play all the trumpets and get the band going in order to start your paper. And I know part of that, too, is just because you don't know what to write when you sit down in front of that blank page, which is fine. But what I want to stress, and what I want to definitely stress with this introductory paragraph right here, is that for all of this fanfaronade about, the Faust chapbook and Faustian stories and so on and so forth, there is literally one sentence in the entire introduction that actually has substance to it. Go ahead. Make your pick. Yeah, it's not the one you're thinking of, in all likelihood. It's this one. That's the thesis statement in this paragraph. Like, I realize there are tons of facts here. There's the Faustian story that has been traced back to the first Faust chapbook written in this particular date. We have the introduction of the two works, Faust Part 1 and The Master and Margarita. We have the introduction of, there are lots of books about Faust stories. Sure. But at the end of the day, all I need to know is there are similarities between Bulgakov's novel and Goethe's play. That's the thesis. It's not a good thesis. In fact, it's a pretty general, vague, and terrible thesis. It is not great at all. Fortunately, it gets backed up really well, or else, this paper could totally fall apart. So the first thing I want to talk about here is, A, get rid of all this. You don't need it. It's just a bunch of setting nonsense. At the end of the day, all I need to know is, what are you going to write about? What is the argument that you're going to make? Now, by contrast, here is one of my philosophy students from another few years ago. Notice this approach in the introduction is completely different. There's a little fluff here, but not nearly as much. Notice the title, The Presence of Evil Disproving an Almighty God's Existence. Already, just from the title, we know what my student is going to do in this paper. They're going to argue that evil disproves God's existence. We know which question they're answering. They're going to say that the problem of evil disproves God's existence. We know which side they're going to take, namely that in fact God doesn't exist, that evil disproves him. Everything is known just from the title. But look at the intro paragraph as well. The nature and essence of God has vexed philosophers and religious figures for hundreds of years, with each new generation claiming to know more than the last. This is fluff. We could get rid of it. Boop. Through his analysis of the simplicity of God, Aquinas argues that it is absolutely true that God is not a body. It is impossible for a body to be the most noble of beings. And my student is already off to the races. No, we have a direct quote here, citation down here at the bottom. We have the text that she is quoting. We have the scholar that she's going to be using in her paper. We are already talking about what is the nature of God. We are setting the stage, but we are setting the stage specifically with an eye towards the argument that she wants to write about. Specifically, that God exists and that he is not a body. She goes on. Anselm, yet another writer she wants to talk about, further argues in Proslogian that God is just, truthful, happy, and whatever it is better to be than not to be. We are describing parameters about who God is here, which is important for her argument because it's going to be important if evil exists and God is not the most noble, or if God is supposed to be the most noble of beings, just, truthful, happy, etc., then there's no way that almighty God could coexist with evil. She's making the argument here already. She's already placing her foundational arguments, her presuppositions in play. Regardless, the common accepted understanding of God revolves around a notion of his omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, the key traits in the problem of evil. Evidently, the creator should be a figure of immense power and ability. However, issues arise when one recognizes that evil exists in the world. The question stands, does the existence of evil disprove the existence of God? Now, typos aside, we are focusing our paper with every successive sentence. Here are a couple of philosophers who argue about God being perfect. Here is the common accepted understanding, namely that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. The creator should be a figure of immense power and ability. However, there is an issue when one recognizes that evil exists. Does this disprove God? Although theologians may not identify evil as a compelling argument against God's existence, given the limited understanding of God's faculties, it can be concluded that a benevolent, all-powerful God could not have designed a world in which evil exists. Here is our thesis. Now, compared to the other thesis, it's fantastic. Like, this thesis, there are many points in Bulgakov's novel that are related to Goethe's play, is basically saying Goethe's play is like Bulgakov's novel. They are similar, which is a crap thesis. It is way too general, it is way too vague, it doesn't tell us a whole lot about what she's arguing or what specifically she wants to talk about. By contrast, we have the exact argument presented here. Theologians may say that evil is not a compelling argument against God's existence, but since we don't fully understand God's faculties, a benevolent, all-powerful God could not have designed a world in which evil exists. We don't understand enough to reconcile God with the evil in the world. Therefore, we must assume that God doesn't exist. It's a solid argument, and she will back it up over the course of this paper. When I talk about a controversial claim, something that can be debated, this is what I'm talking about. Of course, Master and Margarita is similar to Goethe's play. It's based on Goethe's play. There are clearly similarities out the yin-yang between these two works. But this is an argument. Theologians say that evil is compatible with God, but since we don't know how that works, we have to assume it's not. It is something that can be argued against, and there are tons of theologians who would totally argue against this, myself included, but it's a good position to take. It's something that can be debated. She will present arguments for her claim. And notice, again, while there is a little bit of fluff in here, there's not a lot. Like, we removed the one major fluff sentence, the rest of it actually serves her argument, even as early as the first sentence or the second sentence in the paragraph. Don't be afraid to jump right in. I've seen students who will, in fact, include nothing in their first paragraph except that thesis statement, and that's fine. Do not feel obligated to write some grandiose introductory paragraph. Get me to the point. Get me to the argument that you want to make. Get me to the body paragraphs that present your details as quickly as possible. Because, again, there's not a lot of space in this paper if you're digging as deep as I want you to. So don't feel obligated to just, use a lot of set dressing, set up a lot of fluff, do a lot of summary. Just get me to the argument. So that's, again, the first principle that I want to emphasize. No fluff. Avoid fluff. And again, you'll notice number 2 here is use a strong central thesis and argument. That's why. The great thing about a thesis isn't necessarily that it's better writing. It will help you write better. If you have a clear idea of what you want to argue in mind, it will make it very easy for you to focus your entire paper around that argument. Notice that most of the other things that I include as general tips for paper writing involve your thesis statement. Keep your paragraphs focused on one point in your argument. Every sentence should contribute to your paragraph's argument. Every paragraph should contribute to your overall argument. If you have a strong central thesis, you will always be able to tie back to it. You will always be able to say to yourself, what is this paragraph doing in my paper? How does it support my central thesis or my argument? And not all writers do this, and that's fine if you don't. There are lots of ways to write this paper. There are lots of ways to get a good grade in here. What I am suggesting is the easiest way, the way that works the best for the most people. Having a strong central thesis allows you to constantly focus on what you're trying to do. Now, that said, there's a viable strategy here where you start without the thesis. Start with your body paragraphs. Ignore the introductory paragraph altogether. Like, if you were sitting down to a blank piece of paper, do not even bother with the introductory paragraph. Or go ahead and write some bullshit, grandiose, like crowd-swelling introductory paragraph full of, since the dawn of time, or whatever. But know that you're going to change it. It is often beneficial that you write your introductory paragraph last, because at that point you actually know what you're going to argue. Like, if you start by going with details, if you start with, in the beginning of the novel The Master and Margarita, before the start of Part 1, he uses a quote from Goethe's Faust Part 1, which was a conversation between Faust and Mephistopheles, i.e. Master and Margarita starts off before the book even starts with a quote from Goethe's Faust. You've got a good point here. You've got a solid body paragraph that you can work with. Here is your first claim. Once you make that claim and all of the claims that follow, then you can go back up and say, okay, what am I actually arguing here? Let's write that thesis. Like, I don't need to know that you wrote it last, that you didn't plan it out, that you just, decided to go and then discovered what you were going to argue halfway along. I change my thesis on a regular basis when I write papers. I can tell you about 5 different times during my master's degree in Boston where I would get stumped halfway through a paragraph, go take a shower, have a brilliant idea while I was, washing my hair, and then go back and change everything that I had written at that point. I would just go forward as far as writing the body paragraphs, but then at the end I would go back to the intro, change the thesis statement, and it would look like I had planned it all along. That's a totally cool strategy, and I'm totally good with it. By all means, use do your thesis statement last if you're not sure what you want to argue at first. Start with your arguments, start with your claims, your content, and go from there. So let's keep looking at this paper, because as much as I trash this poor student's introductory paragraph, she does body paragraphs so right. So in the beginning of the novel, The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, before the start of Part 1, he uses a quote from Goethe's Faust Part 1, which was a conversation between Faust and Mephistopheles the devil. It reads, "Who are you then? I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good," which can be found in Faust Part 1, Chapter 6, page 42. So note, she starts with the quote. "Who are you then? I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good." Now, this is a super important quote from Faust. That's why Bulgakov picks it for his, epitaph before his novel begins. It characterizes evil for Faust, and what Bulgakov is doing is importing that argument for evil. So note how she expands on this. This scene had been from when Faust had been reciting a spell which led him to successfully summon Mephistopheles to him, later questioning who he was when Mephistopheles did not tell him a direct answer. The meaning of this quote is that while the devil is someone who we find bad and is always doing evil, they are actually doing good, because it was God's plan for the humans to go astray and then repent. Now again, the sentence structure here is messy. I do not claim that this student is an artist when it comes to the language. But look at how concise the argument is here. She drops the quote right after she places it. It's in The Master and Margarita. Here is the quote. It is from Faust. What it is doing is explaining that the devil is someone who we find bad, but they are actually doing good. In The Master and Margarita, the connection that this quote has to the novel Master and Margarita is that while the devil, Professor Woland, is causing all this trouble in Moscow with the use of black magic, he is actually trying to get the people to realize the truth and the corruption of the country that they live in. Which gets so close to the core of this novel. She has managed to summarize the entire theme, the entire thesis of what Bulgakov is doing in his 400-page novel in one sentence, because she has looked at specifically why he's using the quote that he is. This is it's not perfect. Again, there's a lot of grammatical issues here, there's a lot of sentence structure problems, but notice how she proceeds, because she does this for literally every body paragraph after this. She starts with the quote. This is the center of her paragraph. Who are you then? I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good. She starts by introducing the quote. Where does it come from? Explaining the quote. Why does the author use it? and then explain what the significance is to the work, the fact that it is showing that the devil is actually doing good work, even though we think of him as evil. And then she explains how it works in the novel. It's thematically relevant. It is explained. But notice, no summary is necessary. Like, she summarizes after she presents the quote. She does not retell the story of Master and Margarita. Instead, she just explains that in the novel, Professor Woland is causing all this trouble in Moscow, but he is actually trying to get the people to realize the truth and the corruption. This is hard analysis, and this is why she got as good a grade as she did, despite her grammatical errors. There is literally no fluff to this paragraph. Every sentence serves her purpose. And look how she continues. Other details that can be found in the Master and Margarita is the poodle head that Professor Woland is described to be holding a stick that has a stick with a black knob shaped like a poodle's head. Again, very rough grammatically, but what she's doing is introducing the quote and presenting the quote. Now she will explain it. In Faust Part 1, Mephistopheles is first introduced in the play in the appearance of a black poodle on page 36 that Faust spots in the corn and stubble, finding it suspicious, but Wagner only thinks of it as an ordinary poodle. In the journal, The Devil and Dog Form by Barbara Allen Woods, here is her research. Published in Western Folklore, she writes that the reason that the devil is linked to the dog form is because that, in German folklore, these dogs are most often described as large and black, sometimes shaggy, fiery eyes. They are usually poodles. That is most likely why Goethe, a German writer, decided to use a black poodle in his writing, and Bulgakov getting his inspiration from Goethe using the same metaphor to help the readers realize that Professor Woland is the devil, along with other clues that he gives. Again, it's super complicated and super dense, but it also has zero fluff. Here is our quote, our detail. Woland carries a stick with a black knob shaped like a poodle's head. It is important in the Master and Margarita because Professor Woland carries it. It is important in Faust Part 1 because Mephistopheles is introduced as a black poodle. It is significant culturally because, according to Barbara Allen Woods, in German folklore, these dogs are most often described as large and black. These are our devil dogs, and they are often poodles. There is a relevance to the culture that Goethe is tapping into, and that Bulgakov is getting his inspiration from Goethe. So the connection runs all the way through. Now, admittedly, the point of this argument isn't great. Like, she's basically saying here is a similarity between the texts, which you'll remember is, in fact, her thesis. There are many points in Bulgakov's novel that are related to Goethe's play. I would much prefer that she had, like, something significant to say about this, like something that relates to the theme, like she does up here in the first body paragraph. But barring that, this paragraph totally works. It is incredibly effective at getting its message across. And notice each of these paragraphs successfully communicate a separate idea that relates to this theme. Paragraph 1, Bulgakov has the same thematic idea here, that the devil actually does good unwittingly. Paragraph 2, Bulgakov uses Goethe's details to indicate that he is pulling from Goethe. The same will continue in further paragraphs. Here are some minor details. We've got the contract in blood, which also is reflected in Bulgakov. There is a major time difference, but while the contrast that she's drawing is while the Romantic period is when Goethe is writing, it's at a different point that Bulgakov is writing, and she talks about that a couple of paragraphs down. So each of these paragraphs is so tight. It does everything right. As much as, again, there are grammatical issues up the yin-yang, and there are other problems with, like, the greater structure, this is what a good paragraph looks like. Which brings us to a couple more of the points that I want to talk about as far as, like, how to write a good paper. First off, never include a quote without explaining it. I have seen so many students who are like, they think to themselves, I have to include quotes in order for this to be a research paper. And to do this, they basically end up just dropping a quote into their text without any explanation. Here is a quote from the book that we read in class. Here is a quote from this article that I found online. And then they don't explain it. Like, they will be going along, minding their own business, writing about the Iliad or the Odyssey, writing about Descartes or Nietzsche. They'll be like, okay, so Homer writes, here is my quote, this illustrates nothing. And that's it. Like, they don't explain it. They don't bother to say, this is an example of Achilles like being disrespectful to Agamemnon, or this is an example of Hector being awesome and like following his decision to be honorable. They just drop the quote in. Like they'll say, Achilles is very concerned with his own honor, as Homer writes. Achilles loved Patroclus and he's great, and move on to the next topic. No, every time that you include a quote, you should both introduce it if possible, or just drop it in for effect, and explain it. Make sure that it is relevant to the argument that you are presenting. Each of the paragraphs that this student presents is centered on a quote. It is a direct quote or a direct detail from the textbook or from the book that we read in class. That's what I'm looking for. The quote should drive your paper. It should be the central focus. You should find really good quotes that help to best illustrate the point that you're trying to make. If you are going to argue that Achilles is a petty little wimp and that Homer is telling us not to pay attention to his love for his own honor, then don't find the passage where he's talking about how much he loves Patroclus. Find the passage where, like, everyone dies and Achilles is sitting around saying, this is my fault. Find the passage that says that Achilles is himself sulking in his tent. Find the passage where all of the Greek soldiers are standing around like, dude, where's Achilles? We could really use his help right now. Likewise, if you're writing the philosophy paper, look for the passages that best express what you were trying to say. Don't run with, like, Descartes' ideas on free will if you're writing a paper on Descartes' argument for the existence of God. Look for his summaries. Look for the passages where he, like, tells the entire argument in 1 or 2 sentences. Find something that is concise and then explain it. Include it. Show why he's arguing, why this is an argument for the existence of God, why Achilles' pettiness ultimately causes his own destruction, why, Hector's decency ultimately is futile in the defense of Troy. All of these paragraphs should absolutely be based around a quote, a detail, a significant grab from the text that you're looking at, but it should also be explained. How does it relate to the rest of the culture? How does it relate to the rest of the text? That's what I'm going to be looking for. But the other thing that you should keep in mind is keep those paragraphs focused. Don't get too out there with your arguments. Don't slip from topic to topic. I can totally understand if you are making an argument about, like, Achilles being his own destruction, his lust for honor causing him great pain, and you drop a quote about, like, him sitting in his tent and then have to explain that because he is sitting in his tent, Patroclus dies, and then he regrets it, and then he has to die himself. That's fine. But keep it focused on the one point, the quote that you're in fact including. Don't branch out. Don't, like, explode into, like, this huge discussion of the Greek culture from just this quote. Do that in another paragraph. Keep your paragraphs focused. And lastly, again, the rule of being efficient, of being concise, every sentence should contribute to the paragraph's argument. Every paragraph should contribute to your overall argument. This is like a very tight argument. Every paper should be like that. The most efficient papers, you can look at every sentence and say what that sentence is doing in the paper. What is this sentence doing? It is explaining that there is this thing in the Master and Margarita which we are going to realize has a connection to Faust Part 1, which ties into the thesis, that there are many points that are similar between these two works. What is this sentence doing in the Journal of the Devil in Dog Form, etc., etc., etc.? It is explaining why Goethe uses a black poodle as his image for the devil in Faust Part 1, which is what Master and Margarita is borrowing, which is one of the similarities that are between these two works. Now, as far as working towards the overall argument, again, that paper on the Master and Margarita and Goethe's Faust isn't great because the thesis isn't terribly strong. But my student in philosophy does this one extremely well. So notice we have this setup. So there is this argument God does not exist because evil exists in the world and God is supposedly perfect. So our first body paragraph again starts with a quote. Australian philosopher J.L. Mackie addresses the problem head-on, saying, God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. This is a clear-cut summary of the problem of evil, and while I generally am frowning upon summary, notice that she couches it by making it somebody else's words. By making it a quote from Mackie, she both fulfills her responsibility to, in fact, include quotes and do research, but she also introduces the whole argument very succinctly and concisely, because that's what Mackie is doing. But more than that, she doesn't stop there with Mackie. Mackie insists that this contradiction is only a problem for someone who believes in the traditional idea of God as a perfect being. Through what he terms adequate solutions, Mackie explains that if a person is prepared to say that God is not wholly good, or not quite omnipotent, or that evil does not exist, or that good is not opposed to the kind of evil that exists, or that there are limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, then the problem of evil will not arise. She quotes Mackie again, but notice this is the crux of his argument. Like, she doesn't bother with his, fiddly details and so on and so forth. She is saying that Mackie is telling us, if you're willing to throw out the traditional idea of God, if you're willing to reject that God is omnipotent, or that God is totally 100% impossibly good, or that, evil is in opposition with good, then there won't be a problem of evil, and you don't have a problem with the existence of God. As she says, as she explains, the existence of evil does not prove anything if God is not thought to be all-powerful and good. Essentially, a theist cannot argue that a benevolent creator designed a world with evil as a main element. Mackie furthers his argument by addressing what he terms fallacious solutions, such as good cannot exist without evil, since evil is necessary as a counterpart to good, and evil is necessary as a means to good. He observes that in each solution, in order to solve the problem, one of its constituent propositions is given up, but in such a way that it appears to have been retained, and can therefore be asserted without qualification in other contexts. Mackie is challenging the traditional solutions to the problem of evil, where usually you have, good is in order for good to exist, people have to be free. In order to be free, they have to be able to do evil. Mackie's so what you're saying is good is still good, evil is still evil, but somehow they're compatible now? Mackie insinuates that theists avoid the obvious contradiction of their religion by arguing that evil is part of God's plan. If this is so, their God, a benevolent, all-good, all-powerful being, does not exist. So again, we have a very tight, very carefully presented argument here. This paragraph is on Mackie's position. Now, unlike the other paper, it does cover multiple topics. It gives us the summary of the problem of evil generally. It gives us Mackie's solution to the problem of evil, namely that you have to reject one of these principles. Either God is not perfectly good, or God is not omnipotent, or that evil does not exist. And she presents Mackie's argument against theists, who typically try and have it both ways. In order to solve the problem of one of the constituents, it's given up, but not really. And this is not okay. That means that their God does not exist in any real sense. They might as well be atheists in that case. Once again, we have this particular argument contributing to her overall thesis, namely that if you are willing to change your understanding of God's faculties, then yeah, you can solve the problem of evil, but then it's not God in that way. A benevolent, all-powerful God could not have designed a world in which evil exists. The problem of evil holds. It still obtains. Every one of her arguments pushes this idea forward. Mackie presents her case, what she wants to argue for, and then she's going to bring up the counter-arguments. On the other hand, Thomas Aquinas argues in the Summa Theologiae that it must be said that every evil in some way has a cause, for evil is the absence of good. Only good can be a cause, because nothing can be a cause except inasmuch as it is a being, and every being as such is good. Human beings are endowed by good with naturally good qualities, and evil occurs when these qualities are absent. So evil doesn't necessarily exist. God is not actively initiating the existence of evil. Aquinas is arguing what Mackey accuses theologians of doing. She's bouncing these ideas back against each other. But notice she goes ahead and argues from Mackey's position. Mackey argues that this sets a limit to what God can do, saying that God cannot create good without simultaneously creating evil. And this means either that God is not omnipotent or that there are some limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. In short, here is Aquinas' argument defending God. Here is Mackey's argument rejecting Aquinas' argument. The two scholars are conversing. They are having a conversation. This is what I mean by the conversation when I talk about the conversation in academic literature. Here is one great philosopher. Here is their argument. Here is a modern philosopher who rejects this argument. That's how academia works. Now, in the mythology class, it'll be tougher to find these sorts of arguments. You probably won't be able to track them down given the time constraints on our hands. It is kind of like, it'll be great if you do. Like, if you want to make an argument about, like, what was the military perceived to be in Homer's time? Was it glorified? Was it rejected? Here's evidence of it being glorified. Achilles is great. He's awesome. He kills Hector. The Greeks celebrate him. His name is remembered forever. But on the other hand, Ares is a jerk, and everybody hates him, and war is generally frowned upon when it's just done for one's own good. That absolutely, you can find that debate in scholarly circles. It probably won't be as clear as J.L. Mackey literally commenting on Aquinas' argument, but you can still find that same discussion if you're digging deep enough. But even if you don't, you'll find people in their own time. You can find Plato talking about why Homer is crap. You can find, scholars in their own time. You can look at Hesiod versus Homer and see that they have different attitudes on what Zeus looks like or how the gods are supposed to behave. By all means, look for these arguments. Compare and contrast these details. This student is very aware of what her argument is going to look like at the end of this paper. She knows that every time she brings up the argument from someone she disagrees with, she's going to have to find somebody else arguing against that, Mackey or otherwise. And she'll go back and forth on this. And her next paragraph is on the dialogues concerning natural religion. Here's David Hume arguing that the problem of evil holds, so she agrees with him. On the other hand, here's Alvin Plantinga presenting the free will defense. He is rejecting J.L. Mackey's position, but J.L. Mackey rejects the free will defense. It's a good solution, but it has its own problems. The argument does not support itself. Mackey proposes, and here's Mackey rejecting Plantinga. Then finally, here we are at the conclusion. Although it may seem agreeable that God allowed the existence of evil in order to ensure man chooses what is good, it is simply impossible for God to be both the enabler of evil and a supreme perfect being. While Aquinas and Alvin Plantinga argue that evil is a necessary part of the design of the world, but the idea that God allows evil so that greater good can come from it, however, philosophers like Mackey argue that there is no logic behind that notion. They may try and explain it away. Evil is necessary for there to be good. Evil is there so freedom can be a thing. But Mackey says no, that rejects it. Hume concludes that humans cannot actually know what a superior being is like. Here is her argument. We do not understand what God is like, therefore making arguments like Aquinas and Plantinga that claim to understand how God is compatible with evil is ultimately just acting like we know more than we do. Instead, philosophers like Mackey have the right idea. There is no logic behind the notion that evil does not conflict with the idea of God. This is a solid argument all the way through. It is backed up by the paragraphs that she includes. Here is Aquinas' position. Here is Mackey's rejection of that position. Here is Hume's position. Here is Alvin Plantinga's rejection of Mackey's position and Mackey bouncing back and rejecting Plantinga. This is the sort of back and forth I would like to see in all of my papers. I would want to see you make a claim one way or the other. Homer argues that Achilles is a punk, or Homer argues that Achilles is heroic. Homer says that, Odysseus is good for tricking other people, or maybe Homer argues that Odysseus is bad for tricking people. That's the sort of argument that I'd like to see, and I want you to back it up by looking at both sides. What are the arguments for? What are the arguments against? Why are the arguments that you are presenting more compelling than the arguments against your position? And again, in philosophy, it's the same deal. If you want to talk about the problem of evil, if you want to talk about reason being better than experience or revelation, this is what I expect to see. Here is my position. Are the arguments against it. Here is why I think those arguments don't hold water. That's what it takes to write like a solid, argumentative, controversial paper with no fluff, a central argument, and that is focused on what you are trying to argue. Every sentence contributes to the paper. Every paragraph contributes to your argument. That's how it works. Obviously, we can talk about this more in the Q&A. This is just like a general guideline, and again, this is hard work. Like, I do not pretend that. It is way easier to write the giant fluffy paper with a lot of summary and like, here is all the things that Achilles does in the Iliad. Great. If you are not going for the A, that's fine. Include your fluff. Know that you will be penalized for it. But if you want, like, again, as I emphasized in the last lecture, you should know how to do this. Like, when you are in that 400 level class writing a paper about something that you honestly, legitimately care about, or trying to impress a professor who holds your fate in their hands, this is the kind of paper they're going to be looking for. They're going to want to see you present a efficient, very concise case for what you are arguing. A case where every sentence functions towards the overall paragraph and every paragraph functions towards the overall argument. That's a good, solid paper. That's the ideal that you should aspire for, even if it's not in my class that you aspire for it, for whatever reason. So, that said, we now need to talk about the actual business of citation. So if you are one of my Montclair students and you are planning to do MLA and you know MLA cold, don't worry about it. I will read your in-text citations, albeit begrudgingly. But I do want to talk about some basic formatting stuff, especially for the Chicago Manual of Style, which I enforce in my philosophy classes. And the reason why I do that is, again, I think the Chicago style is like the best, most efficient style out there as far as like talking about or presenting your paper in a way that is concise and solid and like doesn't get distracting. Like, I think in-text citations are kind of bullshit, honestly, but that's just me. I come from a Chicago style background. Some philosophers don't even do that. So we need to talk about the two things that characterize Chicago style and sort of how to make that work in your paper, since I suspect that most of my philosophy students have not dealt with Chicago style much in the past. So if you're not interested in learning about Chicago style or block quotes or footnotes, by all means, you can check out of this lecture early. Go spend the next 15 minutes doing something else. But we will explain Chicago style now. So first off, like, the first thing that you should know about Chicago style, and that does in fact appear in a lot of MLA papers as well, so maybe hang on if you haven't left already, are block quotes. Now for this one, I'm actually going to be using one of my papers. This is my paper from Boston College on Heidegger's cleared expression. I have a fairly decent command of Chicago style at this point in my career, so it kind of works out. But by a block quote, I mean one of these guys. And you'll notice that my philosophy student does the same thing at certain points whenever she includes a particularly long quote. But by a block quote, what I mean is a quote that is sufficiently long that it would like take up way too much space if you just included it in your paper generally. Like if you just slapped quotes on normal writing at the normal font size. So to make it look neater and to sort of set apart the quotes that you include and make it very obvious when you are quoting, you create a block quote instead. You just set it off from the rest of the paper. Now, a block quote, in order to format, is kind of tricksy. Like, I have seen a lot of students who will, be writing along and then they'll like format for their block quote, and then, they're going to change all their formatting things, and then as a result they look down at the rest of the paper and it's like, oh crap, now everything is formatted weirdly, and now I can't stop being on like half an inch in. So let's talk about how to do this without driving yourself insane. So the three characteristics of the block quote that you should always include when you format a block quote. First off, it's got to be indented. about 1/2 inch. Second, it should be in a smaller font size. Usually it's 2 points less, so it's like if you're working in 12 point, then go down to 10 point. If you're working in 10 point, then go down to 8 point, so on and so forth. Lastly, it should be single-spaced. So you'll notice, again, anytime you see a block quote in one of my papers or in one of my students' papers, it will be indented 1/2 inch compared to the rest of the indentations. It will be a smaller font size. You will notice it's 10 up here as opposed to 12 up here. And then it's single-spaced. Now, the actual way to do this, if you know what you're doing, it's really simple and it's really straightforward. So let's assume, for example, that this sentence right here, which not that one. We need a longer paragraph, something with a little bit more substance. Alright, let's use this one. His knack for careful word choice and the careful invention of words is similar to what some of the ancients did in their own time. Let's pretend that this is a quote. What I suggest, rather than like trying to format the quote all by yourself, is start by just writing it. Like make it its own paragraph and keep going. Make sure that you have at least one line after you write your quote. So here's my quote. I know I'm going to be making it into a block quote. And here is the stuff after the block quote. Once you've got it set apart like this, it's super easy to format it. You just highlight it, just like this, and then you make all of the appropriate changes. You change the font size, down 2 points. You change the spacing, down to single spacing. You change the margins, 1/2 inch on either side. And notice it changed it without changing any of the paper around it. So automatically you've got your block quote and you just keep on going. The only thing I recommend at this point is give it one little hard return, and then it looks a lot nicer. At this point, you would put your footnote, which we'll talk about in a moment, and you've got your block quote. So it's really that simple. It's not difficult to do. Just make sure that you do it in that order, or it will get bad and you'll probably have formatting problems that will plague your paper. Now, as for when you should use a block quote, you should use them whenever your quote would take up 3 lines. So that sentence wasn't really long enough to warrant a block quote, but this one totally is. So if, for example, I was quoting someone there, which I in fact am paraphrasing, but that's another thing, I would definitely need to include this as a block quote. It goes from line 1 to line 2 to line 3, and now it's a block quote. And that means that even if it like starts this late in the paragraph, as soon as it goes up this far, it's a block quote. That's still 3 lines, even though technically it's less than 2. If it's taking up 3 whole lines in your paper, if it bleeds over onto 3 lines of your paper, call it a block quote and then go ahead and format it. And again, just to remind you, because again, I know that this is tricky, just keep on writing like it's no big deal. Set it apart as its own paragraph so it's easier to highlight and work with. Take the whole thing and then make the changes. 10-point font, single spaced, change the margins, and 1 hard return just for making it look nicer. And bam, it's a block quote. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Now, the other thing that characterizes Chicago style as opposed to MLA and other things, and this one MLA really doesn't do, whenever you do citations in Chicago style, you use footnotes, not in-text citations, which I think, again, is really super handy and really nice because it doesn't mean that, A, you're looking at, like, these big, lumpen, parenthetical interjections in the middle of your paper, but also because then you end up, like, looking at the bottom of the page and you're like, oh, I see exactly what you were quoting at any given moment. So, footnotes are just as easy as block quotes as far as the formatting is concerned, perhaps even easier. So when you are doing this, if you are creating a footnote, if I want to say, okay, so this is actually a quote, I would turn it into my block quote. Again, not that I'm emphasizing this enough, but separate it from the rest of the paper, highlight it, change it to single-spaced, 10-point font, change the margins, hard return. At this point, you go next to the end of the block quote, and you just drop your footnote. Now, this is obviously old Word. This is Word 2003, so I'm definitely dating myself here. Like, this is what I was using in college. It's similar in 365. You just have to find the insert menu. There is a reference section. You hit footnote, and this little dialog box comes up, and it's like the same dialog box that they've been using since Word 2003. All you have to do is hit insert, and it will automatically format the page. It will give you the little superscript number for the footnote. All you have to do at that point is go ahead and include your citation. Heidegger, blah, 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 blah. Now, as for the actual content of the footnotes, the rules are pretty much the same for most of the different kinds of formats. So let's look at something that's especially relevant to you. Like, because you were probably using the textbook, you will probably need a textbook citation once or twice. So let's look at the philosophy paper here, because she actually does in fact quote the Classics of Western Philosophy, 8th edition, which is the same book that you were using. Anytime that you quote from the textbook, this is roughly what it should look like. She doesn't actually have it formatted quite correctly, but we have most of the important details and important entries here. So the trick is, this is a super complicated citation. And as a rule, like, don't expect me to go through every potential citation. Use Purdue's OWL site. It has the list of all the potential citations you could run into. So here's like the general format, where, you know, this is what they generally look like. Here is the formatting for your average book. And again, all the weird situations you run into. Here's the book by one author, here's the book by multiple authors, translated, etc., etc. So let's say that you were going to quote Plato. Like, let's pretend that this is a Plato quote from our textbook. So we make the footnote, easy peasy. You know, she's got her formatting weird because it's not actually her fault. It's because, like, she originally submitted it as a PDF and I translated it to Word in order to, like, protect her identity and stuff. So that's largely on me. But let's just set up the footnote here. Let's assume we are going to quote the Euthyphro. You'll start by needing the author's name, in this case Plato, and then you need to write the work that he in fact wrote. So in this case, the Euthyphro. But the trick is, we're not done, because we've got so much more citation to do. First off, Plato is writing a translated work. Like, he wrote in ancient Greek initially, so you'll have to track down the translator. That, in this case, is GMA Grube. You can find his translation or translator information on the first page of the translation he created. So anytime that you're looking at, like, Descartes, who's working in Latin, or Plato, who's working in Greek, just look up the translator information on the first page of the document, and you should be able to find everything that you need to know. But then we have to talk about the anthology. In Classics of Western Philosophy, which is the title of our textbook. Again, this is an anthologized work, so, you know, Euthyphro is just the name of one particular entry in the overall book. Then you need to include the editor and the edition. So it's the 8th edition that we're working with, and then it's edited by Stephen M. Comm. And now we need the publication information. So, open parentheses, the publisher is Hackett Publishing. I believe that the city that it is most likely where it was published was Indianapolis. Not that I've done this before or anything. And there's my clock. I hope Amanda enjoys this, because it's 12 o'clock, so obviously it's just going to go on forever. Thank you, clock. Alright, so definitely Hackett is the organization, definitely Indianapolis is the place where it was published. The 8th edition's copyright is 2012, and then you include the page number that you're quoting it from, like 43 maybe. That's your citation. And I realize it's super complicated. Again, it's because it's like a translated work in an anthology with an editor with multiple editions. Like, it's crazy. I realize that. But this is the information you will need to include if you want to quote the textbook. If you instead want to use Project Gutenberg, that's fine. That one's actually super easy because it's a website. So basically you just write Project Gutenberg, or rather like Plato, Euthyphro, on Project Gutenberg, and then you include the date that you accessed it. So today is 4/7/2020, and then you include the website. So you would have to like actually copy and paste the website. But again, no big deal. And that's what I'm looking for. That's the footnotes. Now, you will also need to include a works cited page or bibliography, as my student does. Again, the formatting got all wacky because of the translations from PDF and back again. But generally, she's got the right information and she's got it in the right order. You should include all of the information in this format, like the author's last name first, and then it's in alphabetical order by the author's last name. So like, whoops, So it would be Anselm, then Aquinas, then Hume, then Mackey, then Plantinga. You typically want to indent the second line in each case, just to make it look a little bit nicer and to keep everything clearer. The actual formatting is very similar to the citations that you present in your paper, but they are a little bit different. You'll notice when you look at the Purdue OWL page, it includes both the citation format for the footnote and also the citation for the bibliography. Mostly the differences are there are usually commas in the footnote, where there are typically periods in the bibliography, and where you use parentheses to talk about the publication information in the footnote, you just have its own citation separately in the bibliography. So I clearly did it wrong because it should have been Indianapolis : Hackett, but oh well, let's fix that. Well, it's too late now because that's not the right citation anymore. Oh well. So anyway, use Purdue OWL to look up your different citations, because again, I can't cover every possible thing you run into here. So I'm not going to like dock huge amounts of points if you don't cite properly, but as long as you have all of the information, you can guarantee that you're not going to get like called out for plagiarism. That's the key here. I need to know where you're working from so I can track it down, so I can demonstrate that you're not like pulling stuff out of your butt or pulling stuff from online and calling it your own work. So those are the two key things you need to do for Chicago style. Block quotes, footnote citations. That's it. I hope that this was informative. I hope that this helps with your papers. Again, I suspect that at this point all the mythology students have run away, but I wish that I could give them well-wishing as well. Again, these rules will typically work for like any paper you write in any of your classes. If you avoid fluff, if you use that strong central thesis, if you keep your paragraphs focused and every sentence and paragraph functional, that will typically get you an A for all of your papers. Like, even I screw that one up from time to time, as much as I am attentive to this stuff. So yeah, hope that this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to pester me in the Q&A about the research paper. Feel free to, watch this lecture a couple times or replay certain parts of it. Like, feel free to mention it in the discussion boards, in the general questions or elsewhere. Feel free to look me up on Discord if you want me to look over a draft or something. I am more than willing to help you at any point in this process. I want to see a good paper. As much as I know that a lot of you are going to blow off this assignment because you've got better things to do, and that's, fine in your own right, like, you get you the grade that you deserve. I always look forward to reading students' papers when they are, like, solid, well-researched, and have something interesting to say. So, by all means, look me up, and I will help you work through this process. Do not panic. That is rule number one here. Do not panic. It will not help you, and it's really not worth it. As much as this is an important part of your grade, I tend to be pretty easy when it comes to the grading. It's pretty rare that I hand out anything lower than a B or B minus, although it is also pretty rare that I hand out an A or even an A-. So good luck to you. Again, let me know if you need any help. Feel free to use all the resources at your disposal. Feel free to find other people to talk to about this. Feel free to use other references online. And I'll talk to you later at the Q&A and elsewhere. So good luck.